About a minute before we get started. Okay, some people are saying hi. Hi, Nina. Hi, people. People are joining. So I'll give it another 20 seconds. We'll start.
Sure.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Let me first of all welcome everyone and also Robert. Robert is joining us today from Singapore. So he's a bit later in terms of time. It's about bedtime for him now, but we're very glad.
Not quite that old.
Not quite yet. Yeah, originally when I asked you to do this, we said something at 4 or 5 my time, and that was really bedtime there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we changed it to this earlier time to be more convenient for you as well. So thank you. Very exciting for this event today. Very excited. I met Robert about, we were introduced about a month ago, 2 months ago now. We had a couple of discussions in looking at new topics for us to do as part of our webinar series. A lot of the people who I see their names joining us, they know the EIMF, European Issue of Management and Finance, very well. And this is something we like to do this as part of our public lecture, open webinar kind of events we do every year. Robert's background, very exciting, and the topic very exciting. So he was I'm very happy that he accepted the invitation to join us in this event today. So Robert, as I said, he's in Singapore. He's the founder of Ethics Insight. He has around 20 years experience managing investigations, risk assessments, crisis responses, ethics and compliance advisory support. He works across several countries and probably more than 30 different sectors as well. If I'm saying anything wrong, you can correct me, Robert. His experience runs in probably more than 50 different countries of actual work that he did. His professional experience is on fraud investigation, examination, counterintelligence, threat analysis, and behavioral analysis, investigating, interviewing at large. Today, we're doing the topic of behavioral analysis and investigation, a very interesting topic. I'm going to sit back so I can enjoy this webinar as well. Just a couple of things. If you have any questions at any stage of this presentation, just ask them using the chat or the Q&A. I will be here trying to support Robert in this event. So if anyone has any question, just ask it there. I will, if it's needed to be answered immediately, I will pause Robert. Robert also has his chat open, so we'll be here to make this a bit more immediate. So if you see something, you want to ask a question, ask it immediately. Use the chat, is the fastest way, or the Q&A. We'll be here to support immediately. Okay, thank you very much, Robert.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Marios, and thank you all for taking the time out of your days for this. As mentioned, I will be looking at the chat. When I'm presenting my screen, it's sometimes not super easy to jump between the two, so forgive me if I'm a little slow, but I would welcome the questions throughout because we're going to cover quite a lot of different topics. So if we wait to the end, you may have moved on, or maybe the point has been missed. If we bring the topic up when you have the question, we can try and address it then. And I'll try and address as many questions as possible. So there is going to be, a presentation element. My intention is to solicit information from you as well. And also there's going to be videos and other ways to sort of demonstrate the content. So as Marios mentioned, the focus is behavioral analysis, but in particular, given the time constraints, I'm focusing in on one area, which is the truth. There's a lot of, when you first approach this topic, people will talk about deception detection, but we're not actually interested in detecting lies. What we're trying to find out is the truth, what actually happened. If we see the lie, that gives us an indicator we haven't yet got to the truth. So the focus is on obtaining the true information. I'm starting with the behavioral analysis part. That doesn't mean I'm going to ignore the investigative interviewing bit. It's just I want to start on the bit which I suspect is of most interest to you, and we can go back to any sort of investigative topics and tactics and interviewing techniques later on. So what is behavioral analysis? We're talking about observing humans across these 6 channels. Face, in terms of the micro expressions, and I'll cover that in a bit more detail, so don't worry if I'm not explaining every concept completely on this screen. The interaction style, so somebody who's quite fluent speaker, for example, suddenly starts to be stuttery, or maybe they are normally very casual and conversational, and then they become very formal. We're looking for changes in interaction style. The voice, that's the pitch, the tone, and the volume, because they are linked to emotions. Like, it's no great surprise that our voice goes down when we're a bit sad, when we're angry, it increases. So we're looking at changes in voice as well. And we're also interested in what's being said, the actual words, because the words need to sync with everything else. What we're saying in a truth story should match our expressions, our body language. If it doesn't, that's something to kind of probe. The body language area I put down in that bottom corner, because it's the bit that people obsess about most, but it's the least, at the moment, the least scientifically proven universally. So body language is still, in many situations, quite culturally specific. Different gesticulations, different hand gestures, how common that even is in certain cultures. If you think about, say, the Italian culture versus Japanese, you have a very different attitude to sort of displays of the hands and talking in most sort of contexts. But body language still can give us some clues, and there are a couple of areas where it's quite interesting, particularly single-sided shoulder strokes, which tend to indicate we're not confident in what we're saying. Psychophysiology, this is pretty fun stuff. When I did further studies in behavioral analysis for a few years, and the psychophysiology bit is not going to be hugely helpful for you guys, unfortunately, in this virtual setting, because what we're talking about there is we're talking about things like changes in respiration, sweating, perspiration, changes in the body temperature. These things can be detected with some tools, but I'm guessing you probably don't go to work with a polygraph and or a thermal imaging camera. And the reason I mentioned thermal imaging camera is there was an interesting study that the guys I was training with did. They were asked by European airports authorities to see if they could identify potential threats, so terrorists and smugglers and other people like that. And so what they thought that they should look for is the first premise of the airport authorities was, let's see if we can find where the angry people are. And when we're angry, the temperature in our arms goes up about 1 degree. When we're fearful, the temperature in our legs goes up about a degree, because the blood goes to the part of the body that we think we'll need for fight or flight. And what they found in airports is about 60% of people are angry. So it's not really very helpful. So the psychophysiology, very fascinating topic, not very useful for most of us. So I'm not going to cover it beyond this slide, but I'm very happy to take any questions that you have about it. And having actually gone through the polygraph test as part of that sort of further studies, I can tell you it is quite an uncomfortable area as well. What are we looking for when we're analyzing across these channels? Well, we're looking for basically a deviation from the baseline at the core, but we have to consider other things as well. And the first thing to say as a starter is there is no universal indicator that someone is lying. There's no Pinocchio's nose, unfortunately. It would make our lives a lot easier if there were. The first thing we need to consider is the context. So what is the relationship between you and the other person or people? So if you're seeing lots of fear on someone who's been called in for an investigation because there's been an allegation made about them, that really shouldn't be hugely surprising in that context. Maybe it would be more surprising if they seem really happy about it. But with context, be careful of me theory, which is saying, I wouldn't behave that way in that situation. We still, with all these things, we need to have the questions and the investigative tools to dig a bit deeper. The second thing we're looking for is kind of consistency. So if you ask somebody to recount an event, they should be able to do it fairly consistently if it's a true event. They should also be able to recall information from any point in the story. Because what we do when it's the truth, we've experienced it. So we can jump around anywhere in that story. When it's a lie, we tend to rehearse it like a train track in a straight line. So asking us to jump around in the story can sometimes cause a lot of like cognitive load, which is why cognition is there. If you're seeing people sort of their wheels spinning as they're trying to come up with questions, that's useful. I see that a lot with my kids when they're lying, and you're starting to catch them in that, and you can see almost the brain kind of whirring as they're trying to come up with something. And that then leads to spontaneity. Is the account, if you're asking people questions that are relatively easy for them to answer because they experienced it, there should be a level of spontaneity. But don't confuse that with memory. We are pretty awful at memory, all of us. And the way this was demonstrated to me was one of the experiments I volunteered to be part of. Was we were subject to sensory deprivation and kind of mild torture, basically trauma. So blindfolded, headphones on, bashed around, sort of dragged through a building. And then afterwards we were asked to sort of provide all these details about what we heard, where we'd been, how long we were in that situation. And our minds fill in a lot of blanks. There was about 6 of us went through that same experience at the same time. When we were asked afterwards how long it went on for, the lowest number was 25 minutes. Somebody else thought it had gone on for hours. The truth was in between. So our memory is a bit bad, but don't confuse that with spontaneity. You should be able to answer a question about an experience with spontaneity. It doesn't mean you will remember it correctly. So I hope I'm kind of making sense. I've got the chat open here. If there's anything that you'd like to qualify so far, just ask me. But I'm going to move into the micro expressions. And if you're thinking, well, who's this guy? This guy is Paul Ekman. He's an American scientist who took on work that was started by Charles Darwin, the evolutionary biologist. Darwin observed in primates, monkeys and us, that there were certain universal emotional triggers and facial expressions. And Ekman took this on and he tested it. He went to live with the Fure tribesmen, which is a tribe in Papua New Guinea. He went and tested it in Japan, in the States, in different places. He tested it on people who are visually impaired, so they've never been able to see the expression of another person. And what he worked out was there were these 7, and there's 4 on the screen here, universal emotions that would display across our face. But micro expressions are called micro because they come on in 1/25 of a second. And I'm not this next slide, the slide after, I'll give you a chance to kind of spot them in slow-mo, then in real time. So surprise, it's not a great, that's normally a pretty easy one for most people to spot. Sometimes we confuse it with fear because the eyebrows are raising in both sides. The way to spot fear versus surprise is surprise, you tend to go straight up, whereas fear, there might be some coming together of the brows in the middle. And secondly, with fear, you might get if you think about the emojis are actually very well constructed because they have to display that emotion in a very, very simple cartoon. So the one where the teeth are like that one for fear is, but you're not always going to see such a remarkable display of fear. You might just get like a very brief sort of flicker where you don't actually see too much teeth whites. So if you want to test yourself on this stuff, there are a lot of cool resources. There's this guy, Paul Ekman's got a website. And there's a tool called the Micro Expression Training Tool and the Subtle Expression Training Tool, where there's just partial expressions. They rotate the face at different degrees, so you can start to sort of spot them at different angles. And the good news is most people can get quite good at these with a bit of dedicated practice. So this was not a natural area for me when I started studies. I was much more skewed towards the verbal side of things, the tone, the content, etc. And so I had to learn micro expressions. And when you first do it, you will score, if you're lucky, around 50%. But with a bit of dedicated practice, in a month or 2, you can get up to around 90-95%. That doesn't mean you're detecting truth or deceit 90-95%. It means you're better able to observe a flickering emotional state. But one of the big things I learned when doing these studies is just because these are subconscious often, just because you've seen it doesn't mean the person themselves has recognized it. And when this was brought home to me was we were doing a study, a game basically during the studies, where we each pulled one pebble out of a bag, and it either said T for true or F for false. And then we had to think up a true or a false story about a particular emotion. And this lady in our group picked out her stone. We didn't know what it was. And she told what was meant to be a happy story about the birth of her first child, but she kept doing like little flickers of sadness. And so people were like, you're lying, you don't have a true story. And she said, no, I do. And then somebody asked a better question saying, is there any reason that you might have felt a tinge of sadness when your child was born? And she said, you know what, when he was actually put in my arms for the first time, I remember thinking, I wish my father had been there, because her father had passed away shortly before that birth. So she was barely even aware of it. So sometimes I found it's almost a bit invasive occasionally when you see these things, because the people may not always know what they are representing to you. That's the bad news. The good news is to really look for micros, you need to be very focused, and you need to be really looking quite intently at the person, which we don't naturally do in most conversational settings. So hopefully these three to start with are relatively familiar to you. And then we'll go into one of the ones that are maybe a bit more unusual. So disgust, they think, has an evolutionary purpose, because it kind of closes off our nose, and often we'll turn away when we're disgusted. And disgust often follows sensations we don't like a bad smell, for example. So it's trying to get away. But it can be very interesting in a workplace setting if you're asking people about interactions with colleagues, and you start to see that one. Contempt, is the only unilateral, by which I mean it's the only one that occurs just on one side of the face. Everything else should occur on both sides of the face. And if you just hold that kind of contempt thing, you'll start to actually feel pretty good. It has a weird psychological effect on you. And it's how we try and assert superiority over other people. Even if that person might be our boss, you do that face at them, makes you feel a bit better. So Darwin observed this a lot in chimps, and particularly the male chimps who are trying to dominate the pack. Sadness, not that difficult for most people, but quite difficult to fake. The reason it's difficult to fake is the overwhelming majority of us, when we try and do sadness, our brows aren't matching. One will be up a bit, so we'll look a bit like Roger Moore, the old Bond character, when he does his sort of single-shaded eyebrow. But the reliable indicator for sadness is when both of the brows come up together. The other thing with sadness is when you see kids particularly trying to mimic this mouth bit, they will push up their lip. Like, I'm sure if any of you have spent any time with a toddler, you'll see that a lot. That's called a chin boss, and that's actually using different muscles to push up your mouth. With sadness, it's muscles here pulling down, so it's actually really quite hard to instantly fake, particularly to fake in a short setting. And finally, happiness, which we leave to the end because obviously it's the cheeriest, but it's also pretty much the easiest for most people to recognize. But you know the expression, the clue's in the eyes. So the genuine happiness, so if I'm smiling now and you think, is that genuine happiness? The easiest way to tell is you just put your hand over there, and if the eyes are just looking pretty dead, as they might when you're not genuinely happy, then that's a good indicator it's faked happiness. Whereas if somebody is really happy, you will see like the lighting up of the face, the crow's eyes, the eyes sort of closing in, and it's muscles around the eye, not just pulling out the eye, that will be working there as well. So these micro expressions, really cool if you can get your head around them. And I'm going to play a video now. And with the videos I'm playing, some of them are a bit old, and there's a good reason for it. You see the URL in the bottom there, that's where this content comes from. This is the partner organization I deliver a lot of this work with, and they're the ones that train me. They have quite a strict kind of ethical code about the videos they use. They don't want to be using anything current, anyone serving currently in their job, currently in political office, or anyone who is subject to ongoing investigation, and that would include appeals. So you have to really wait until either there's been the person's left their job, they've left office for a period of time, or they've gone through the appeals process and it's been decided one way or the other, then it's fair enough to analyze their testimony or their statements without sort of potentially prejudicing their right to kind of fair trial or fair treatment. So this next video is the CEO of a UK organization called the Cooperative, which is a bank and also a retail business. And he is being quizzed live on national television about the results. The first bit of the video, I'm playing at incredibly slow speed. So it's going to be a little bit sort of, bear with it. There'll be bits where there's not that much happening, but I want to show you that these micros happen within a 25th of a second. So we really, really slow it down to show you just how exaggerated they are, because you may look at all these faces and think, no one does that without me noticing. And then when we play it back at real speed, you go, oh, okay, they do that without me noticing quite a lot. So let's have a look.
Well, let's speak to Peter Marks, he's the Chief Executive of the Cooperative Group at the Stock Exchange for us. Peter, good morning to you. Just looking at your results that you published this morning, last year you had record results, profits up there almost 50%, but you've called this some of the worst trading conditions you've seen in your history at the firm. Are there any signs out there that it's getting better? Now, the update on your supermarket business, of course, still challenging out there as you talk about because consumer spending is squeezed. Your banking division doing a little better. Just talk us through some of these things.
Yeah, well, as you say, overall, what was a record year last year, we think, in the context of the economic climate, is pretty good.
So we're just going to pause it temporarily there. When you slow it down that much, you can see some pretty strong disgust, strong anger, even a tiny bit of contempt. But when you heard him speak, you could see this was not matching with the voice. He's obviously an accomplished presenter because he's a CEO and he's comfortable on national television. But now we're going to see it in real time. And given that I primed you, you will see a couple of the micros, but try and be honest about how many of them, whether you actually spot everything when it's played in real time, because it really brings it home that once you start to be able to detect these at that 90-95% rate, it's really quite revealing around what the person might be thinking, or at least gives you those good avenues to ask questions.
I wish I could say there were, but in the short term, which is the next 12 months, we don't see many signs of the consumer being more confident.
Now, the update on your supermarket business, of course, still challenging out there as you talk about because consumer spending is squeezed. Your banking division doing a little better though. Just talk us through some of these things.
Yeah, well, as you say, overall, a 6% fall against what was a record year last year, we think, in the context of the economic climate, is pretty good.
So what do you think? Do you think you would have been able to spot it on that first time? By all means, sort of enter your responses in the chat. But I certainly find it quite interesting when you start to realize, because we have a natural tendency to maybe, it seems some people gravitate more to what someone's saying and how they're saying it. Other people will be watching them. And so there is that sort of observer versus listener split. And so some of you in the observer camp might have picked it up more. Pick up a bit of disgust, and so Matteo, but anything else is tough. It is. But if you, just with a little bit of practice, you'd be surprised surprised how quickly you can start to pick up a lot more. So it's when I started doing these studies, it was very, very helpful for me. It was it just gave me a bit of a map around the person's emotions around certain events that then you can use to ask questions, obviously in a kind of a sensitive way. But it was really interesting when you start to be able to see these a bit more in real time the more you practice. So body language, the bit that everyone writes most about, and there's a zillion and one books, like if their feet are pointing towards the door, then it means that they're guilty and they want to leave. If their eyes looking up this way or that way, it means this or that. The problem with a lot of this information is no one's done studies to a broad enough cross-section of humanity and to a statistically relevant position yet that we can definitively arrive at kind of conclusions. There's some promising studies being done around like pupil dilation and things like that. But unless you're planning on taking in a micro camera, you're going to distract people's eyes, that's not going to help you much. But let's focus on what we can work with. And a lot of this will depend on your familiarity with the local culture and custom. Gestures, they're very cultural specific, but if you're working within your own culture or within cultures you're familiar, then it's useful if the gestures don't match with what's being said. We often use them in terms of instead of speech. So, that's a common gesture. But the key thing with a lot of body language, particularly as relates to the hands, is what's called the presentation box, which is basically all that you can see of me now. So in a virtual setting, body language is the most hampered of all of the channels of communication, because what we really like in body language is what's happening outside the presentation box, because that's what I'm doing subconsciously and I don't want you to see. So there's a really funny study, I'm sure you can find it on YouTube, where a professor is giving brutal feedback to his students. And then they're shot, they're just sat 2 chairs next to each other, facing each other, and the feedback. And when you look at some of the students, one of them in particular starts to give him the bird, but rubbing her knee as he's giving her this scathing feedback. So we're doing these sort of subtle gestural slips that sit outside the presentation box. So when and if some of you may already be there, you're in in-person settings, body language becomes a bit more useful. But what you're looking for here is things that people aren't trying to represent to you. And particularly illustrators and gestures, you're looking for the consistency. So like Bill Clinton, when he did his defense of I did not have sexual relations with that woman, it was very interesting from a language point of view. Mr. Folksy, Mr. Yarl suddenly is I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Lots of distancing language, formal language. But if you watch his batons that he used to use to emphasize speech, they don't match the tenor of it. If I'm using batons, they better emphasize the bits I want them to. That's when we know that they're sort of consistently reliable, even though I was faking that. But this is why I don't like body language. The eyes, there's some schools of thought that say when we're lying, we will try and hold somebody's gaze and we'll try and look at them really intently. It's not universal. So what we're looking for there is a deviation from baseline. Somebody who normally looks at you a lot and then suddenly starts looking anywhere else but you when you're talking about a certain topic. That's more useful for us in terms of body language. The illustrators, things to accompany speech. So the head nods and head shakes are really interesting if they are culturally relevant. So in different cultures, particularly in South Asia, they have some different connotations, or nuances is a better word. But you will often see the people give themselves away if head nod means affirmative and head shake means negative. Sometimes when you ask people, are you lying to me? After you've built up your case and you've presented it to them, they'll go no while they're doing a very, very subtle micro nod. And we'll see an example of an incongruence in head shakes and head nods in the next video. Manipulators, touching parts of body, stroking, comforting. Again, what we're looking for is to try and work out what that person's baseline is and when it changes. So if we suddenly see an increase in manipulators, particularly the sort of comforting grooming thing, that's often us trying to self-soothe. So we're not feeling comfortable in that situation. So maybe that gives you some sort of data that you can look to. So, but again, be careful. You have to observe what that person naturally does. So I had a colleague who just used to stroke here the whole time whenever he was thinking. So that wasn't telling me anything about his mental state or whether he's needing comfort or anything. It was just telling me that's something he does when he thinks. And tension, again, tricky in this virtual setting, but for when and if we're back in in-person settings doing investigations, that's the anchoring, like feet planted on the floor. How does that change? Are we trying to like physically hold ourselves in chairs? Are we leaning away in? Again, those aren't indicators of anything in themselves. What we're looking for is how that matches with what's being said and the bit of the story. So if there's a bit of the story that they're kind of leaning away on, you're like, okay, they don't really like that bit of it. Why is it that they don't want to talk about that? And it may be that it's traumatic for them, it's uncomfortable, but it could also be some deceptive reason. The next video is a particularly charged one. It's from the UK. It's a guy who was later accused and found guilty of the murder of 2 kids. And he kept going on the media whenever the media are around, and which gave us a lot of video footage, which often we don't get with these type of suspects unless the police release it. So he becomes a useful study in that point of view. And it's grainy, old, like bits unsteady footage, which is why I'm showing it, because it shows you even in, if you've got a bad connection or you're doing a Zoom thing, you still got enough sometimes to get some useful body language out of it.
How do we know they were here at 6:15? Well, we have an eyewitness. Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on? The girl that doorstep, grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach in St Andrews. You know, just said she worked very good and she got the job. And they just said, please tell her that I'm very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
So I'll play the police scene in just a second. You can see how subtle body language is. And I personally find it the hardest of all of the things to spot across those 6 channels, because aside from the single-sided shoulder shrug, which once you start to notice it, and we're not talking about something like that, we're talking about a micro thing, like what I'm doing now, but in a very spontaneous way. So that tends to be an indicator of a lack of confidence in what we're saying. But the head nods and head shakes, they're never like that. They're never like a kid does to you when they're trying to convince you. They're more of a, if we're actually leaking our emotional, in something contradictory and emotional, then it is very subtle, very, very subtle. So body language, I find very challenging. It's worth the effort if you can do it. And some of the people who I've seen who are real experts at it, it's phenomenal. It's impressive when they can read it well. Micro expressions, strangely, are a lot easier to spot in my experience, but that may be different for you. Now, the next bit of the scene is interesting because the police did release it, and it's his full body. So now you see how much more we have to go on once you can actually have someone's full body. And you also will probably start to realize, if you haven't already, and I suspect a lot of you do, given your jobs, that the old style interview setting, a big table between the two, the opposing parties, or the interviewee and the interviewer, is pretty terrible if you want to get full body language. It's much better to actually be sat without that barrier in between if you want to observe it. And this next scene there's so much leaking. I've just picked out with the little bubble some of the bigger highlights, but he's leaking across every channel in this scene. So you have a change in the vocal content and style. You have him repeating a very simple question, and by time, which is a common tactic. You have the manipulators going, the shifting, the leaning away. It's in literally, I don't know how long it is, like a few seconds, there is just a world of behavioral analysis information being relayed.
Throughout any of these, was there any occasion that you actually had physical contact? Throughout any of these, was there any occasion that you actually had physical contact?
So did that physical contact, no, the single-sided shoulder shrug with the manipulator, and the shifting back and sort of the protection with hands. I mean, it's an interesting response to a question. We have to, of course, consider the context. He's now in a police interview. So it's not unusual for somebody to be nervous and fearful. But when we get such a cluster, and when people are on the hop, when they think that you've got them or you're coming for them, that's when we start to leak across all the channels. That's when even the super polished people who normally only might leak across one or two channels, it really starts to fall apart. The words, the body language, the micro expressions, the gestures, the whole lot. So the voice interaction style and content is my happy place, in the sense that it's the bit that comes most naturally to me and where I spent most of my time. We're looking for differences in pitch, volume, and tone, which hopefully relatively self-evident. They have associations with different emotions, but again, we're looking for changes in the pattern and the spontaneity. The interaction style, the normal flow that the person has, whether they start to be evasive in terms of dodging questions, whether they're unclear, or conversely, if they're doing impression management. So one of the things that you'll often see people do is it's almost like a kind of convincing statements, like I'm a good person, I wouldn't do this. You know, the way that they're trying to sort of manage the impression, or they're trying to give you a great impression of themselves. If that changes, you know, if the person is just somebody who's always trying to do that, that's not particularly revealing. But if suddenly they start to sort of peacock a bit, that's really interesting. Why are they doing that? Are they trying to deflect? What's going on here? And sorry, I'm just moving around the chat window. And please do keep the questions if you've got any, because we're going through this quite quickly. Content, tense changes, if that's relevant. So in some countries and cultures, obviously you don't have the tenses that we do in most, I understand most of you are calling in from Europe, so most European languages, tenses is distinguishable because of the words used. In other countries, it's distinguishable because of the context. So like a time predicator, for example, like in Chinese. So tense changes, if you've got them, they're useful. Neha Sharma is just saying the session is not audible. Is that an issue for anyone else? Because I'll stop for a sec if it is. Could it, if you can hear it, could you just put in the chat that you can hear? Okay.
Hi, Robert, I can hear it very well, actually. The sound sounds very good. I don't know, there is one issue with one user there, but the sound, yes, everybody can hear it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll continue. So distancing language, I gave the example of Bill Clinton with that woman. CBCA, what does that stand for? Content-based criteria analysis, which rolls off the tongue. It's a German system. It's not without its critics. It was developed as a way to assess the credibility of a statement from a child in a criminal investigation. So if the child's testimony is important to that investigation, how do you assess its credibility? Some US states have also taken it on. Some people like it, some people don't. My view on all these things is they are potential tools. It's about learning to master them and using them in the right context. But the CBCA, their theory is there's I think 20 criteria, but the top sort of 5 or so, the truthful accounts, have what they call embedding of unnecessary contextual detail. So a lot of us, when we tell stories, will bring in information that's really not core to that story. We'll describe interactions if it's truthful, because we were there. We don't have to make up the voices and what other people said. We don't have to put words in their mouth, which we might do if it were a lie. The easiest way to describe it is a truthful story is often like spaghetti, whereas a lie goes along a train track. So the truthful stories will jump around. In truthful accounts, so by the CBCA criteria, we might also correct ourselves. No, sorry, it wasn't that time. I did, self-correction, not without anyone prompting us going, no, it can't have been 9 that I left, because on that day I take my kid, so those type of self-corrections that we would do in experienced accounts. My problem with CBCA is if you're a really skillful liar, you can start to hack how to compose more credible stories. But I still think it's got some usefulness, because what I find helpful about it is when you see it is helpful on the extreme, like when you see an account that's just got none of that interactions or descriptions or embedding of context detail, just goes straight line, quick, start to end. That's where CBCA is kind of helpful for me. I'm like, a good way to manage that is to ask the person to tell the story backwards. If you've experienced it, you can tell it any which way you want. If you haven't experienced it, you probably haven't rehearsed it backwards. Verbal slips. This one, you'd be amazed, particularly after a long interview, how many people, when you say to them, have you been lying to me throughout this interview? And then they'll shake their head and go, yes, oh no. And we can often, unfortunately, let ourselves slip up with our verbal slips. This is my happy place. Now, I'm going to show you a video. I'm not splicing it or slowing it down. I'm not putting the bubbles in it, because this guy is giving you a lot along all the channels. It's very good on the interaction style content, in terms it's very rich on that topic, but there are some good micros in there. There are some good body language indicators in there as well. What I'd like you to do is I have a break slide between this video and then when I break it down in the following video. In that break slide, if you can just think as you're watching it of what you observe, and then maybe just stick it in the chat, because I'd be really curious to see what you pick up in a real-time video. There's a bit of an intro that explains, it's just a reporter for a news station in Ireland explaining the context, so I don't need to explain that for you.
It's 2 weeks ago today since Rachel O'Reilly, the 30-year-old mother of a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old child, was brutally beaten to death at her home in Baldara in North County Dublin. Her family said today they believe Rachel knew her killer. We all just, discussions amongst ourselves, feel that she probably knew this person. The attack happened in the bedroom, and if it was just a random burglary, it was somebody she wouldn't know, and after a few blows to the head, probably wouldn't recognise. But why kill her? We feel because she could identify that person. So it's quite possible that this is someone she knew, this is someone we knew, and therefore someone out there who knows us will know this person. The family don't believe burglary was the motive either. Her mother Rose said she believes the killer moved and stole a few items in the house to stage the scene.
I don't know why I was so positive, but from the word go, I felt it was sort of staged. I can't tell you why. And I still feel a very strong feeling that it wasn't a burglary.
Even what we can gather was that has been taken so far doesn't just, not that anything can justify that what happened, but it just doesn't justify the violence and the excess of what happened. It just doesn't fit. Rachel's husband Joe also said the killer would have been covered in blood and took towels from the house, which he believes he used to clean himself. The majority of the blows that I saw were to the back of the head and around to the back of the ear, and some on the top of the head. But again, my memories are quite fuzzy, as I'm sure you can imagine. There was some bruising on her arm, so I feel, as Jim and Rose feel, she would have been some kind of a fight. If there's bruising on her arm, that would signal to me that she was blocking whatever was hitting her head.
Okay, so in the chat, if you're comfortable, I'm curious to get anything you spotted. If you want to come out with a pronouncement about whether he did it, whether he murdered his wife, and how you decided. I'm not going to like leave the chat open in an awkward silence for minutes on end, but if you've got any instant kind of observations or feelings, that'd be really helpful, because that's a real-time just conversation like you might actually experience if you're sat with someone. So it's a good chance to see what kind of things you're spotting. If you're not comfortable, of course, that's fine. If you're all polished and continuously raised eyebrows, yeah, when you see that slowed down, thanks, Nicholas. When you see that slowed down, you'll see that that's interesting, because there's actually a couple of different emotions there, with depending on which way the eyebrows are pointing, like angry birds for anger or fear. Tension between the eyebrows, great spot. They all look weird to me. Yeah, I don't know whether weirdness is a indicator necessarily of guilt or truth, but thank you. The other thing as well is if there's anything that you heard in the language, that would be interesting to see what was spotted. A lot of details towards the end. Yeah, that's that coupled with the micro expressions and the facials, you'll see that's super interesting. Angry, yeah, keep shifting his shoulders. Yes, yeah, the anger one when he was trying to hold it for a sustained was interesting, because it's obviously impression management. But then there are some flickers in there as well. One thing, did any of you get a sense about whether this guy is like a kind of flowing, normally quite lucid, confident speaker? Yeah, he did look surprised. He surprised himself, and you'll see that in a second. He really surprised himself. He terrified himself, actually. Not surprised, he made himself very fearful. But when we're watching again, just look at the beginning, or when he's talking about petty and consequential things, just observe his flow, his natural language flow, and how like a confident speaker he is. Okay, so I'm going to go on now and break it down, and then we'll have a bit more time afterwards. So keep them coming.
Today, since Rachel O'Reilly, the 30-year-old mother of a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old child, was brutally beaten to death at her home in Baldara in North County Dublin. The family said today they believe Rachel knew her killer. We all just discussions amongst ourselves feel that she probably knew this person. The attack happened in the bedroom, and if it was just a random burglary, then it's somebody she wouldn't know, and after a few blows to the head, probably would recognize.
So I'm going to stop a couple of times. Happened was very emphasized. The attack happened in the bedroom. Okay, maybe her body was found there, so maybe that's where you need your other evidence to go, well, is there any evidence that the struggle took place elsewhere, or where was she found? Where was it initiated? Was there blood in different rooms? So that evidence then helps you give the context. But in this case, it was pretty definitive. And that was kind of interesting. The outside, just outside the presentation box, I'm going to stand up a bit. Doing this, the subtle thing that he didn't think he's doing of mimicking blows to the head, that's pretty interesting. But watch out also for the we all bringing other people in. Liars like to bring other people in to their deceit because they hope it adds like some sort of group credibility.
But why kill her? You know, we feel because she could identify that person. So it's quite possible that this is someone she knew, this is someone we knew, and it's therefore someone out there who knows us will know this person.
Okay, so see where he's just going. He's a pretty lucid, fluent speaker, and he can jump around in some quite complicated grammar there. It's even hard. I'm a native English speaker, but it's not easy to flow with him, but he's clearly flowing with that language well. So this is a pretty fluent guy. So now, and after the mother has spoken, we're going to see that change a little bit.
The family don't believe burglary was the motive either. Her mother, Rose, said she believes the killer moved and stole a few items in the house to stage the scene.
I don't know why I was so positive, but from the word go, I felt it was sort of staged. I can't tell you why, and I still feel a very strong feeling that it wasn't a burglary.
Even what we gather was that has been taken so far.
Okay, so Angelia, your great spot. He goes from anger, flicker, into minor happiness, that's a weird facial thing to be showing when you're on TV discussing the murder of your wife. And also watch the language. The reason I've slowed it down, Mr. Fluent is suddenly becoming a little less fluent.
Just not anything, just what happened.
Yeah, he does it proud.
Just doesn't justify the violence and
So you saw the eyes go from side to side. Again, it's not universally indicated, but often I sometimes we have a preference. Some of us, when we're thinking, eyes will move in a certain thing. So you can see right now, it's the wheels are slowly starting to fall off. There's thinking going on as emotions are being portrayed. His words aren't as fluid. This isn't going as well as he hoped it's going. So he's gone from that proud bit to something else soon.
the excess of
Voice drops down.
just Rachel's husband Joe also said the killer would have been covered in blood and took towels from the house, which he believes he used to clean himself. The majority of the blows that I saw were to the back of the head and around the back of the ear.
So I'm going to stop it there. So now he's seen blows. If English wasn't his first language, or if he wasn't very literate, then okay, then maybe that doesn't tell us that much. But for somebody who's got we've established a pretty good command. Yes, he's seen blows, and he's pointing to very specific spots on someone's head. Is that really I mean, there's a danger for the me theory, but is that what you're going to see when you go in and see your wife dead on the floor? You're going to go, oh, there's a blow there, and there's another one there, and there's a one there. This is getting a bit interesting. Surprised how easy and satisfying it was to kill old couple at scale. Yeah, the father is inconsolable. Generally, he's just in a sustained period of sadness. The mother has got a lot of scar tissue damage on her eyebrows, which make her facials quite difficult to read. But otherwise, she's relatively consistent. But yeah, they're obviously they're traumatized by it. But watch how they're seeing the blows, and then he suddenly starts to go, "What have I just said?"
And some on the top of the head, but again, it's my memories are quite fuzzy.
So I'm just going to take that back a tiny bit so you can see like a full. Sorry, I'm going to go back. This is the problem with these things.
It's 2 weeks ago today.
Let me see if I can just fast bring it along a bit. Sorry about this, guys. The bit of technical issues here, but that very end bit where you see this rabid fear come in just after he's gone and given himself away.
2 weeks ago today since Rachel already.
So maybe I'll just.
Mother of a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old.
I think we've seen the end. That fear bit was the last bit, so I'm maybe going to skip on. But you saw as it goes. My memory's a bit fuzzy, as I'm sure you can imagine. He's just shown this massive fear release. So that to me is really interesting. Yeah, there is a tension. There's a thing called duping delight, and if you Google that or YouTube that, it's going to be quite interesting because, I mean, there are some people who got away. Well, in my view, they got away with things who you might be able to spot when you do those duping delights. There's some people that kind of like the thrill of thinking they've got away with it, but then when that turns on them, not so much. So just to bring it in, because I want to allow obviously any more time for questions, previously for an investigator, you'd often have this very sort of tactically minded approach. Like, have we got the recording? How are we going to present evidence? Have we got like tape to tape out the room if we're doing it in an office where people are going to come in? And do we have tissues in case people get upset? Bottled water, we're going to be in there all day, maybe even protein bars, all these kind of things, because they go on for ages. So it was often quite a tactical minded process. And in a way, I quite like what has happened now, where we've been forced to really focus in on often limited information. So even if someone's turning off their video, they're still giving you 3 channels. So you've still got verbal content, you've got style, you've got the the tone. So they're still giving you a bit, even if they're only writing to you, you've still got the verbal content. You've got the criteria-based content analysis. So that gives us all the chance to really kind of master and focus in on these areas of behavioral analysis. So in a sort of a map for, I guess, the investigation 2.0 or whatever it is, consider the culture and context. Because obviously cultural considerations have an impact on body language, but also the organizational culture and other things will impact how somebody might react to you. And the context, do they know what's going on? Has it been fully explained to them? Are they a witness? Are they a suspect? Where are you doing it? If it's in a virtual setting, you're gonna have to plan and prepare and check and test again and make sure all of the things like the mic and all that kind of stuff is working. And how are you gonna present evidence virtually? How are you going to secure testimony or a statement? And then who are you actually meeting? How might you build rapport with that person? What kind of questions are you going to use? And we didn't have time today, because normally these sessions can be quite intense, to go into different questioning techniques. But the questioning techniques are like the tools that you use to open up some of these emotional responses. And then the final bit is like an analysis of a multi-channels. If there's one thing I can tell you that it sounds super basic, but it will, I'm sure many of you are doing it much better than I was, but I was often way too caught up taking notes and not looking at the person. And so one of the things that I had to learn to do in my late 30s was to look at a person and still be able to write fairly coherent notes whilst not ever looking away from them. And I learned little shorthands for different emotional expressions, like angry bird eyebrows would indicate anger. So, which is pretty easy to draw, just up, up. And so little shorthands that you can develop for yourself so that you are 100% focused on the channels that the person is giving you and not looking down at your notes or your evidence or going back to point A, point B. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I know that time is pretty much up of the allotted time. And Marius, back to you and anyone else who's got questions.
Hi, Robert. Yes, excellent. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation. I guess everyone can QR scan the code and get into discussion with you to get in touch. Now, we have a question from Rana. Can social anxiety disturb the study?
Yes and no. If you don't spot it, for sure. If you spot that the person is anxious and that is their normal baseline, then you just start to look for things going either way from that. So one of the reasons that when we're at the beginning of the question, we try and build up rapport and we ask the basic questions is we're just trying to see what someone's normal response to the different types of questions might be. So there's obviously the explaining why we're here, what's your role, what's your job, could you just talk us through things that have got relatively low emotional stakes. If that person is somebody who feels social anxiety, then hopefully as the interviewer, you will be sensitive to that and you're not going to push them too hard on anything emotional. But even if somebody is suffering from whether it's depression or anxiety or in an otherwise strong emotional state, let's say they've had a family tragedy, and we have to get information from them, we have to do that sensitively. And I would never advocate an adversarial approach. You always want to be building rapport and to be keeping it even and to be open and nice with the person you're speaking to and making them feel comfortable. And that's going to increase your chances of getting to the truth. And your job is to get to the truth. So if that person with social anxiety is telling you the truth, fantastic. If they're deceitful, unfortunately, we still kind of need to know that, but we need to do it very sensitively. But yeah, it's a good point. Being aware of the emotional state of the person on the other side is really important.
We can take another couple of questions if anybody has a question. I do have a question myself, Robert. My question is mainly looking at the slow motion and everything else presented. Okay, Zinaida is asking which books do you suggest for reading as well?
Okay, it might be easier for, I'll try and think of some off the top of my head. So Paul Ekman has written a bunch of books. They are actually quite dense, so you need to be really into the topic. There's one that links to Darwin's work as well, so that's quite good for the micro stuff. For more general investigative kind of questions and strategies, Spy the Lie, which is written by a few 3 ex-CIA officers, that's pretty good. And then there's one called Here, and Here is like the HEAR, but it's all in caps, and it's called, I think, the Rapport. It's like, I've forgotten the exact title of the book, but it's, if you just type in Here, Rapport, and terrorist, it will come up. And the reason it will come up is because the 2 people who wrote it are psychologists that interviewed a lot of terrorists. And they have a very good model that works as well with a kid as it does with a terrorist, about building rapport with someone in a very non-confrontational way, where you can use the appropriate amounts of kind of mirroring language. So those latter 2 books are good for the investigative interviewing. For the deception detection, behavioral analysis stuff, honestly, I learned most of it by doing and observing videos. So it was courses that helped me a lot more, but I had to read a lot of course books, and they were all kind of dense. I enjoyed them because I'm a bit of a geek for this, but I'd hesitate to recommend too many of them. But start with Paul Ekman. And that's EKMAN.
Shall I share his website here with everyone? Yes. So any other questions, everyone? If we have no more questions, we'll close. The only thing I wanted to ask as well is about I don't know how fast you can view these micro expressions. I'm just wondering if you're talking to somebody and if you're asking some questions, or is it like a two people act? Do I need a second person to observe and me ask questions? You know,
that can help for sure. So when we were doing it, and when I've done it in settings, I often prefer to be with an observer and I'm the listener. And so but you can do it on your own. You're going to miss a tiny bit, but often you as you've seen, people, when they're really being deceitful, they leak across so many channels that you don't need to catch every single one. Like, you guys caught most of the Mike O'Reilly stuff, pretty well. So what I would say is I wasn't a natural with the micro expressions, but by doing the training, I got myself to a position where I was able to get distinctions in it. And that's not because I'm great. I'm not great. So if I can do it, then you sure as hell can, because I know a lot of people around me are much more natural at the micro expressions than I am. Like my daughter, for example, is a natural, and it came to her much more quickly than it does to me. It came to me after a lot of hard work. So if I can do it, you guys can do it for sure.
Okay, so thank you, Robert. Thank you very, very much for doing this for us, this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Enjoy the rest of your days, evening for you, afternoons, wherever everybody is at. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in our next event, I guess, for most of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Bye.
Bye.